Have you ever noticed how many men can talk about work, sports, or problems in the world, yet when it comes to their own feelings, the words suddenly disappear? It's not because men don't feel deeply. In fact, many men carry oceans of emotion beneath the surface. The real question is, what happened that taught them those feelings were not safe to show? Because a boy is not born emotionally silent. Somewhere along the way, he learns that vulnerability brings ridicule, punishment, or rejection. And when that lesson is repeated enough times, silence begins to feel safer than honesty. If we want to understand why so many men struggle to express their feelings, we must look beyond personality and start looking at the emotional training that begins long before adulthood. When a boy is very young, he is naturally expressive. He cries when he is hurt. He reaches for comfort when he feels afraid. He laughs loudly when something brings him joy. In those early years, emotional expression is not a weakness. It is simply part of being human. But something often changes as he grows. At some point, a boy hears the familiar messages that echo through many cultures. Be strong. Don't cry. Man up. Stop being so sensitive. These phrases may sound small in isolation, but repeated over years they carry a powerful lesson. Certain emotions are unacceptable for men. The boy quickly learns that showing sadness may lead to embarrassment. Showing fear may lead to mockery. Showing vulnerability may lead to rejection. So he adapts. Instead of expressing pain, he hides it. Instead of asking for comfort, he withdraws. Instead of sharing confusion, he tries to solve everything alone. This adaptation is not a flaw. It is a survival strategy. Children are biologically wired to preserve connection with the people around them. If emotional honesty threatens that connection, the nervous system quickly finds another way to cope. For many boys, the safest strategy becomes emotional suppression. Over time, this pattern becomes deeply embedded. The man who struggles to express his feelings today is often the same boy who once learned that his feelings made others uncomfortable. By adulthood, the habit has become automatic. When something painful happens, he may not even recognize what he feels. The emotional signals are there in his body. Tightness in the chest, heaviness in the stomach, restlessness in the mind, but the language for those feelings was never fully developed. And without language, emotion becomes difficult to share. This is why many men express distress indirectly. Some throw themselves into work. Some retreat into silence. Some express pain through anger because anger is the one emotion society allows men to display. But beneath that anger, there is often grief. Beneath the distance, there is often fear of rejection. Beneath the silence, there is often a deep longing to be understood. Many men want emotional closeness. They want connection, trust, and intimacy just as deeply as anyone else. Yet when they try to open up, something inside them tightens. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system remembers what vulnerability once cost them. This is why understanding men's emotional struggles requires compassion rather than criticism. Telling a man to just talk about your feelings is like asking someone to speak a language they were never taught. Emotional expression is a skill, and like any skill, it must be learned in an environment where it feels safe. When a man experiences acceptance rather than judgment, curiosity rather than pressure, and patience rather than criticism, something remarkable begins to happen. The walls slowly soften. Words start to form where silence once lived, and the emotions that were hidden for years finally begin to find their voice. Because the truth is simply, men are not less emotional than women. They are often simply less permitted to show it. And when we create spaces where men feel safe to be human, not just strong, not just capable, but human, something powerful changes. The silence begins to break. I will tell you some reasons that why men struggle to express their feelings. Very first is that early emotional conditioning. A boy does not enter the world emotionally guarded. In the beginning, he is open, expressive, and instinctively honest about what he feels. When he is hurt, he cries. When he is frightened, he seeks comfort. When he feels joy, it radiates through his whole body. His emotions move freely because, at that stage of life, they are simply signals, natural expressions of his inner experience. But very early in life, many boys encounter a subtle yet powerful shift in how their emotions are received. A little boy falls and begins to cry. Often, the response he hears is not curiosity about his pain, but a quick correction. You're fine. Be strong. Boys don't cry. Sometimes the message is not spoken directly. It appears in the form of laughter, impatience, or discomfort from the adults around him. In those moments, the child absorbs something profound. He learns that certain emotions create tension in the people he depends on, and children are exquisitely sensitive to this tension. The developing nervous system of a child is organized around one central need: maintaining connection with caregivers and belonging within the social group. If expressing sadness or fear threatens that connection, the child will instinctively adapt, not because someone explicitly commands him to change, but because his survival instincts quietly guide him toward whatever preserves acceptance. So the boy begins to study the emotional rules of the environment around him. He notices that anger is sometimes tolerated, even encouraged. Strength is praised. Toughness earns approval. But vulnerability, sadness, fear, uncertainty often leads to subtle withdrawal from others. A parent may grow impatient. A teacher may dismiss his distress. Peers may mock his sensitivity. These experiences may seem small, but repeated over years they become powerful emotional training. The boy slowly begins to reorganize his inner world. Instead of expressing sadness, he learns to hide it. Instead of sharing fear, he tries to appear unaffected. Instead of asking for comfort, he pushes his feelings inward and attempts to manage them alone. This process is not conscious. It is not something a child sits down and decides. It is an adaptation of the nervous system. His body learns that emotional restraint increases safety and belonging. Over time, the child who once cried openly begins to silence his own signals. What happens then is not that the feelings disappear. Human emotions cannot simply be erased. They continue to live in the body in muscle tension, in restlessness, in bursts of anger, in quiet loneliness that has no clear language. But because the expression of those feelings was discouraged early on, the boy grows up without a clear pathway to communicate them. By the time he becomes a man, this pattern can feel like part of his personality. People may assume he is emotionally distant or unwilling to open up, yet often what is happening beneath the surface is something much more complex. His nervous system has spent decades practicing emotional containment. The pathways for vulnerability were rarely strengthened, while the pathways for suppression were reinforced again and again. In many ways, what we see in adulthood is simply the continuation of a lesson that began in childhood. The tragedy is that this emotional conditioning often leaves men isolated from their own inner experience, not because they lack depth of feeling, but because they were never given the safety required to explore those feelings openly. When a boy grows up in an environment where emotions are welcomed with curiosity instead of discomfort, something very different happens. He learns that sadness does not threaten connection, fear does not make him unworthy of love, vulnerability does not cost him belonging. In those environments, emotional expression becomes strength rather than shame. But where those conditions were absent, the boy learns to protect himself the only way he knows how, by turning away from the very feelings that once sought understanding. And that early adaptation, formed quietly in childhood, often follows him throughout the rest of his life. Second thing is that fear of rejection or judgment. Human beings are profoundly shaped by the need for belonging. Long before we learn to reason or analyze our experiences, our nervous system is already scanning the environment for one essential question: is it safe to be who I am here? For many boys and men, the answer to that question becomes complicated the moment their vulnerability is met not with understanding, but with rejection. Imagine a young boy gathering the courage to show what he feels. Perhaps he admits he is scared, or hurt, or confused. These are not dramatic moments. They often occur in ordinary situations: a child crying after being teased, a boy admitting he feels left out, a teenager revealing that something deeply embarrassed him. In those moments of honesty, he is taking an emotional risk. He is trusting that his inner world will be received with care. But often, that openness is not met with safety. Instead, the response may come in the form of ridicule from peers, laughter in the classroom, a dismissive comment from a parent, a casual remark like, "Why are you being so sensitive?" Sometimes the response is even subtler: a look of discomfort, impatience, or embarrassment from someone he trusts. None of these reactions may seem severe on their own. Yet to a developing nervous system, they carry a powerful emotional message. They tell the child that vulnerability threatens connection, and when connection feels threatened, The body remembers. Our nervous systems are not designed to forget emotional pain easily. They are designed to protect us from repeating it. When a boy experiences humiliation or rejection, after expressing vulnerability, his body quietly records the experience. The next time a similar feeling arises, sadness, fear, confusion, an internal alarm may activate before he even realizes it. His mind may not consciously recall the earlier experience, but his nervous system does. The message becomes clear, showing these emotions is risky. Over time, this protective system becomes stronger. Instead of expressing what he feels, the boy begins to anticipate how others might react. He imagines the judgment before it happens. He predicts the ridicule before the words are spoken. And so he chooses silence, not because he has nothing to say, but because the cost of saying it once felt too high. As the years pass, this silence can become habitual. Many men grow up carrying emotions they have never fully spoken out loud, not because they lack depth of feeling, but because the internal calculation has been running for decades. Will I be respected if I show this? Will I be dismissed? Will I lose my place among others? The fear of rejection becomes woven into the act of vulnerability itself. Even in relationships where safety might exist, the body can still hesitate. A man may care deeply about someone and still struggle to open up. He may want to explain his pain or his fears, yet something inside tightens the moment the words begin to form. That tightening is not stubbornness. It is the echo of earlier experiences where honesty led to disconnection. What we often interpret as emotional distance is frequently emotional protection. Underneath that protection, there is often a longing that many men rarely articulate. The longing to be seen without ridicule, to share pain without being diminished, to express uncertainty without losing respect. When that kind of acceptance becomes possible, when vulnerability is met with patience rather than judgment, the nervous system slowly begins to learn a new lesson. The old expectation of rejection can gradually soften. The walls that once protected the heart may begin to open little by little, because the truth is that men do not fear emotions themselves. What many men fear is the experience that once followed those emotions, the moment when honesty was met not with understanding, but with dismissal. And until the body learns that vulnerability can coexist with acceptance, the instinct to remain guarded will continue to feel like the safer choice. And also lack of emotional language. When a child is growing up, one of the most important skills he develops is the ability to recognize and name his inner experience. This ability does not appear automatically. It is something that is learned slowly through relationships. When a child feels overwhelmed and an attentive adult helps him understand what is happening, "You seem upset," or "That must have been scary for you," or "I can see you're disappointed." The child begins to connect bodily sensations with emotional meaning. Over time, he learns that the tightness in his chest might be sadness, the restlessness in his body might be anxiety, and the warmth of connection might be joy or love. This process is how emotional language develops. It is not simply about words, it is about awareness. A child learns to notice his internal states and gradually builds a vocabulary that allows him to communicate those states to others. But for many boys, this kind of emotional guidance is largely absent. In many families and cultures, feelings are not explored or discussed openly. Conversations revolve around behavior, performance, or discipline rather than inner experience. When a boy becomes upset, the response he receives may focus on fixing the situation quickly rather than understanding what he is feeling. The discomfort is brushed aside, the tears are quieted, the moment moves on. The emotional experience itself remains unnamed. Without those moments of reflection, something important is missing from the boy's development. He continues to experience emotions in his body because emotions are unavoidable, but he does not develop the language needed to understand or communicate them. As he grows older, this gap often becomes more noticeable. Inside, he may feel tension, irritation, emptiness, or heaviness. His body carries signals that something is happening emotionally. Yet, when someone asks what he is feeling, the answer often becomes vague. "I'm fine. I don't know. It's nothing." This is not necessarily avoidance. In many cases, it is genuine confusion. If a person has never been guided to explore their emotional landscape, it can be very difficult to navigate it later in life. Feelings may appear as indistinct sensations rather than clearly identifiable experiences. A man may recognize that something feels wrong, but struggle to explain what that something actually is. This is why many men express emotions indirectly. When sadness has no language, it may emerge as withdrawal. When fear has no language, it may appear as irritability. When shame has no language, it may transform into defensiveness or anger. The emotions are still present, but without vocabulary, they cannot move through the usual channels of communication. Over time, this lack of emotional language can create distance in relationships. Partners may interpret the silence as indifference or emotional unavailability, while the man himself may feel frustrated by his inability to articulate what is happening inside him. There can be a sense of being trapped within feelings that have no clear name, yet the difficulty is not a personal failure. It is often the result of a developmental process that never had the opportunity to unfold fully. Emotional literacy grows in environments where curiosity about feelings is welcomed rather than avoided. When people are invited to notice and name what they experience internally, they slowly become more fluent in the language of their own emotions. And when that language begins to develop, even later in life, it can be profoundly liberating. A person who once felt overwhelmed by vague internal sensations starts to recognize the nuances of their emotional world. What was once confusion becomes clarity. What was once silence becomes expression. The feelings were always there. What was missing was the map to understand them. And very heavy thing, cultural expectations of masculinity. From a very early age, boys begin absorbing messages about what it means to be a man. These messages rarely arrive as formal lessons. They come quietly, woven into everyday conversations, media, family expectations, and the subtle reactions of the people around them. Over time, these repeated signals create an invisible framework that shapes how a boy understands masculinity and how he understands himself. Within that framework, masculinity is often associated with strength, control, and independence. A man is expected to be steady under pressure, capable of solving problems, and able to carry responsibility without appearing overwhelmed. On the surface, these qualities can be admirable. Strength, resilience, and reliability are valuable human capacities. The difficulty arises when these traits are interpreted in such a narrow way that emotional expression begins to feel incompatible with them. Many boys grow up sensing that a man should remain composed regardless of what he feels internally. If sadness appears, it must be hidden. If fear arises, it must be overcome silently. If vulnerability surfaces, it is often treated as something that weakens one's standing in the social world. In this environment, emotional openness can feel like a risk to identity itself. A boy quickly learns that approval often follows demonstrations of toughness. He may notice admiration when he suppresses pain or handles difficulty without complaint. At the same time, moments of vulnerability may be met with teasing, skepticism, or subtle disappointment. None of this may be delivered harshly, yet the lesson still settles deeply into his developing sense of self. Gradually, he begins to shape his behavior around these expectations. He learns to appear unaffected even when something hurts. He practices staying in control of his emotions because control has been presented as a defining characteristic of masculinity. Independence becomes a point of pride, and needing comfort from others can begin to feel like a failure rather than a natural human experience. Over the years, these expectations become internalized. They stop feeling like external rules and start feeling like personal standards. A man may judge himself harshly for experiencing emotions he believes he should have mastered. If he feels anxious, he may interpret it as weakness. If he feels overwhelmed, he may believe he has somehow fallen short of the image of strength he was taught to embody. This creates an inner conflict. The emotional life of a human being is naturally complex. No one is immune to sadness, fear, longing, or uncertainty. Yet, when the cultural definition of masculinity leaves little room for those experiences, a man may feel pressure to distance himself from parts of his own humanity. The cost of that distance is often invisible at first. On the outside, he may appear composed, capable, and self-reliant, but internally emotions that are never expressed do not disappear. They accumulate in the body and mind, often showing up later as tension, irritability, or a quiet sense of isolation that is difficult to explain. The deeper tragedy is that many men long for connection just as deeply as anyone else. They want to be understood. They want to feel safe sharing their fears, their disappointments, and their hopes. Yet the cultural script they have inherited tells them that revealing those inner experiences may threaten the very identity they have worked hard to maintain. When masculinity is defined too narrowly, it places men in a difficult position. To preserve the image of strength, they must often hide the very emotions that would allow them to feel truly seen. But strength and emotional honesty are not opposites. In fact, the capacity to recognize and express one's inner experience often requires a deeper form of courage. When men are given the space to step beyond rigid expectations and reconnect with their emotional world, something important becomes possible. Strength begins to include vulnerability rather than exclude it, and masculinity expands to make room for the full complexity of being human. And in last, protective survival adaptations, human beings are born with a powerful instinct for connection. From the earliest days of life, our survival depends not only on food and shelter, but on emotional attachment to the people around us. For a child, belonging is not simply a social preference. It is a biological necessity. The nervous system is constantly scanning the environment for signals of acceptance or rejection, safety or threat. When a boy senses that certain emotions disrupt connection, his system begins to adapt. This adaptation does not happen through deliberate choice. It happens quietly through repeated experiences. A moment when tears are dismissed, a situation where vulnerability is met with discomfort, a time when expressing fear leads to ridicule or impatience. Each of these moments may seem small on its own, but to the developing nervous system, they carry an important message. Expressing these feelings may threaten your place within the group, and when belonging feels at risk, the body quickly learns how to protect itself. One of the most common forms of protection is emotional suppression. Instead of allowing feelings to move outward through expression, the child learns to contain them internally. It is not that the emotions disappear. The sadness, fear, and confusion still arise within the body, but the outward display of those emotions becomes restricted. In this way, emotional suppression begins not as a weakness, but as a survival strategy. The child is simply doing what human beings have always done. When faced with the possibility of rejection, he adapts his behavior in order to preserve connection. If silence keeps him accepted, he learns silence. If toughness earns approval, he learns toughness. If appearing unaffected prevents embarrassment, he practices appearing unaffected. Over time, this strategy becomes deeply ingrained. The nervous system starts to recognize emotional suppression as the safest response. The moment vulnerability begins to surface, the body automatically moves to contain it. Words remain unspoken, feelings stay hidden. The person may even lose conscious awareness of what they are experiencing internally, because the system has practiced shutting down those signals for so long. By adulthood, this pattern often feels like part of one's identity. A man may describe himself as someone who doesn't talk about feelings, or someone who handles things alone. Yet beneath this description lies a long history of adaptation. What appears as emotional distance is often the continuation of strategies that once helped him navigate his environment. These strategies served an important purpose earlier in life. They helped maintain acceptance and prevent emotional pain. The problem is that what once protected a child can later limit an adult. The habits that kept him safe in childhood may now create barriers in relationships. The instinct to suppress emotions may prevent him from experiencing the closeness and understanding he actually longs for. What once preserved belonging may now quietly contribute to isolation. Understanding this process changes how we interpret emotional suppression. Instead of seeing it as indifference or emotional incapacity, we can recognize it as the legacy of earlier adaptations. The person is not broken. He is carrying strategies that were once necessary. And when those strategies are met with patience, compassion, and genuine emotional safety, something begins to shift. The nervous system slowly learns that connection does not have to depend on hiding one's inner world, that belonging can exist alongside vulnerability. And as that realization takes root, the protective walls that once kept emotions contained can gradually begin to soften, allowing feelings that were long held in silence to finally find their way into the open. When we begin to understand why many men struggle to express their feelings, something important changes in the conversation. Instead of asking, "Why are men so emotionally distant?" we start asking a deeper and more compassionate question. What experiences taught them that their emotions were not welcome? Because the truth is that emotional silence rarely begins in adulthood. It is often the result of years, sometimes decades, of learning that vulnerability carries a cost. Boys grow into men who have carefully adapted to the emotional rules around them. They have learned how to stay composed, how to manage pain privately, and how to survive in environments where openness once felt unsafe. But beneath that silence, the emotional life of a man is rarely empty. There are hopes that were never spoken, fears that were quietly carried alone, grief that was never given language, and a deep human desire to be understood without being judged. When we recognize this, the path forward becomes clearer. Emotional expression cannot be forced through criticism or pressure. It grows in environments where safety replaces judgment, where curiosity replaces assumptions, and where vulnerability is met with respect rather than ridicule. When men are given permission to reconnect with their emotional world, something remarkable begins to happen. The silence that once protected them starts to soften. Feelings that were buried begin to find words, and relationships gain the depth that only honesty can create, because at the end of the day, men are not less capable of feeling. They are often simply carrying the weight of years spent learning how not to show it.